Hi, this is Alex, and if you love music, well, you've come to the right place because we're all about albums. A comment was left on one of my previous videos entitled The 10 Albums I Cannot Live Without, and it talked about how almost all of my choices except for one came from the 20th century. The viewer commented that it would be interesting to hear what my picks would be for the past 10 to 15 years of the 10 albums I cannot live without. I thought it was a good idea, and yet I've waited 2 years just about to make this video. And the reason is that I think it takes a while to determine what are the albums you truly love. Now, the previous video, I have lived with those albums for 30, 40, even 50 years, and it was much more easy to determine what were the 10 I couldn't live without. But for the more recent albums, I had to kind of think about it a little longer and kind of go back to that idea of what are the albums that seem to stay on my turntable or in my CD player again and again and again, and I come back to despite listening to it 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And that's how I was able to determine what are the 10 albums I cannot live without since 2010. I first want to give you some of my thoughts on which albums are actually eligible for this list. Now, as I said, we're going back to approximately 2010 to the present time to select those albums. Now, an album may be released during that time, but if it's a reissue, I'm not including it. Now, if it's a reissue, but the reissue is from an album that came out after 2010, that's okay. Another rule you may have remembered from my prior video is no greatest hits. The reason I say that is my definition of an album, which is the thoughts, the emotions that went into performing and recording an album by an artist or a band at that time. Whereas if you have greatest hits, you are taking songs from different parts of your career where you were interested in different things. So I don't consider that a true album, but greatest hits are fun, but not eligible for this list. My final rule is one that viewers have commented upon, that they don't think that it's right that I do that, but I can make the rules because it's my video, so there you go. No, but seriously, I think you should only have one band or artist selected in your top 10 that I'm going to pick. I don't think it's wise to pick 2, 3 albums from the same artist. Think of it this way. If you can only take with you 10 albums on a trip and you're going to be away for a long time, and those are the only 10 albums you can listen to, I think you'd be better off having 10 different bands to have a variety of music so that you don't get sick and tired of playing 2 or 3 or even 4 albums from the same artist. Now that I've gotten the rules out of the way, I want to state something that's rather obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. And that is the 10 albums I'm selecting here from the 21st century are my top 10 of today. Obviously, a year from now or more, I may find an album that I would replace my top 10 with, and thus the list would change. That's why I think it's better to wait a while, but the challenge was set, and here we go. Here are my top 10 albums that I can't live without since 2010. First album up is by Aimee Mann, and that is Mental Illness. It's on her Super Ego label, and it came out in 2017. As many of you know, Aimee is one of my favorite artists of all time, and this album is excellent. This album is a pop folk album, as many of her albums are, and they are very clever. They're well written, and they usually are thematic. Now, Aimee has stated in the past that it's not her intention to make an album on a certain theme, but since she's recording songs at a certain period in her life, obviously those songs are going to reflect what's happening to her during that time, and thus the album always seems to have a certain feel. Now, this album won the Grammy Award in 2018 as the Best Folk Album, and I would agree with that pick. I was super excited when the album came out. In fact, I bought both the CD and the vinyl when the album came out on that particular day. Also, I can tell you that I played the album a lot, and my wife, who is extremely picky about music, she loved this album and she had it on her phone and played it constantly when she was outside doing any sort of physical activity. These songs on the album seem to soothe and relax me, even though the topic of these songs are anything but relaxing if you dwell on the lyrics. To me, the album is reflective on life, and it is very observational, as Aimee typically is, and the album seems to have a very intimate feel to it. I think this is a great album to play when you are being reflective on your own life and thinking about different life issues and problems that you are facing. My bottom line is that this is a very excellent album, both musically and, as Aimee typically is, lyrically. It is a very strong album and one that I put in my top 10 albums since 2010. Next up is the album Love Letter for Fire, an album that was collaborative in nature by Sam Beam and Jessica Hoop, and it came out in 2016. This is an album that is always on my turntable. Now, who is Sam Beam? Well, you would know him better as Iron and Wine. Now, what I said about earlier this album, that it's collaborative, and it's collaborative in a very excellent way. And what I mean by that is Sam has a whispery voice, and he has a very soft tone that at times can be a little, not really depressing, but definitely not uplifting. And what Jessica Hoop does with her vocals, she brings those songs to life better. On the other hand, Jessica can sometimes be larger than life, and her songs become quite large in nature, not only musically, but vocally. And Sam works to draw her a little bit back. And with both of these artists working together, the results are greater than the sum of the parts. This is a very beautiful album, which would make it very difficult not to enjoy. And for that reason alone, enjoyment and beauty, I would select this album in my top 10. Their voices are a second reason that I picked this album. Their harmonies are truly magical. Sam's musical catalog always seems to benefit when he collaborates with another artist. Not only here with Jessica Hoop, but he has collaborated a few times with Calexico. And the first collaboration is called In the Rains. This is only 7 songs, but this is fabulous. If you like Iron and Wine and don't know this album, you should pick it up. It is excellent. Also, if you're a Calexico fan, on the other hand, you would also truly enjoy this great CD. My third pick for the 10 albums I can't live without since 2010 is a recent release from 2020, and that is World on the Ground by the great Sarah Jarosz. This is a folk Americana album with truly fabulous singing, and this album won the Grammy in 2021 for the Best Americana Album. Sarah is one of my favorite female singers, and I don't think you're going to hear a better country Americana voice than hers. What sets this album apart is that many of these songs are quite catchy with great hooks, and you kind of hum these tunes after you play the album. I also love this album because it has a homey feel, even though it's dealing with family root issues, which at times can be a bit painful. But her singing allows you to look inside and enjoy it. In fact, it feels like your mom is giving you a big hug. I truly love this record and I play it quite often. Next up, I truly love this album. It's called All Birds Say, came out in 2010 by Carl Broemel. Now, who is Carl Broemel? Well, he is the guitarist for My Morning Jacket, and he now has a solo career and has put out some excellent albums. But why do I love this album? Well, in a word, it is simple. And what I mean by that is the arrangement seems so simple, but yet you have this gentle feeling of, I don't know, like you're being awakened somehow. Now, he has help on this album by his father, who is a professional musician. He plays several woodwind instruments, and he is with the Indiana Symphony Orchestra. This album truly just flows, and it is remarkable how an album with such little production and so stripped down, I come back to time and time again. I find it refreshing every time I listen to this album and marvel at how he could do so little and yet accomplish so much with the album. For you Nick Drake fans out there, this is an album to listen to, and definitely one of my top 10s, and I probably literally played this album 40 or 50 times already. I almost can sing along the words. Anyway, Carl Broemel, All Birds Say, is one of my top 10 picks. Next up is the album Big Time by Angel Olsen. And many of you may have seen that I picked this as my favorite album from 2022. Now, Angel Olsen may be well known to many of you, and you'd be surprised of the type of album this is. She is a bit eclectic in her style, but this album is totally different. This has a country Americana feel. And what's remarkable is if you know where she came from and you listen to her now, you think it's a totally new artist. But she transforms herself and is a very believable Americana artist. There's a lot of lap steel guitars on a lot of the songs, and the songs are memorable and very well written. This album moves from grief to calmness and finally love, almost like she's mourning. And why not? During the recording of this album, both of her parents passed away. For Angel, this is a bittersweet album, one that's reflective of some major changes in her life. Next up is an album that I have many times given critical acclaim to, and here it is, The Harrow and the Harvest. This is the great Gillian Welch, and she collaborates here with her husband, Dave Rawlins. This album is a fantastic guitar acoustic album. This is one of the 2 best-sounding albums on my list. It's on the Aimee label, which is their own label, and this is also pressed at QRP in Salina, Kansas, and the sound quality is outstanding. This is maybe the best Americana album ever recorded, and it's definitely one of my top 3 Americana albums that I play time and time again. This album is very stripped down. It's basically vocals and acoustic guitars, and basically if you strip down the song anymore, I think there's no song anymore. I think they give you just the bare bones, and I think that's part of the beauty of this album, how much you can get out of a song with just a guitar and your voice. The other reason I love this album is the great harmonies that you hear, and not only that, but even on multiple plays, this album's songs still sound mysterious, like you're hearing them for the first time. Just wonderful album, and definitely a top 10 pick since 2010. The Harrow and the Harvest is one of the few albums I give a 5-star rating without hesitation. I believe this is a true masterpiece album. Next up is an album by the Milk Carton Kids called The Only Ones. And you can see this is actually a 10-inch EP, and this album was released in 2019. This is a folk duo album of Kenneth Pattingale and Joey Ryan, and it's basically like several of the albums I have on my list, mostly vocals and acoustic guitar. This 7-song EP has very heavy lyrics and yet is delivered in a very lighthearted way, making it easy to digest. This is a great folk-sounding album with harmonies reminiscent of the Everly Brothers. However, I do have a complaint about this album. It is too short. 7 songs wasn't enough for me, and I guess that's why this is a great album. It's leaving me wanting more. And the Milk Carton Kids have several albums, so if you do listen to this one and love it, there are many others that you can love as well. My next 2 picks actually are jazz albums. And I thought about it and I thought, I've bought so many jazz albums in the last 15 to 20 years. How can I not have a couple on the list? And when I thought about it, there are 2 albums that immediately come to mind, ones that I play all the time. The first one is a surprise album, and I'm sure most of you out there have never heard of this person, and yet it is a current album. This album is entitled Damonia with Strings, and it is by Ferret Odman, coming out in 2015. Now, Damonia is basically a tribute to the great Tadd Dameron, and he was a jazz composer of very many famous tunes. He was also himself a great jazz pianist. Ferret Odman, he's a Turkish jazz drummer, and this band performs pieces that are both classic sounding and yet have a modern twist to them, which is why it really appeals to me. The album relaxes me, even though it has a bit of an upbeat sound to it, which is always a plus. Well, how did I come to put this jazz album on the list over many other great jazz albums? Well, it's easy. This album is on my turntable more than any other jazz album, with the exception of Kind of Blue. I think enough is said. Next up is the album entitled My One and Only Thrill by the great Melody Gardot. And this album, I broke my own rule, came out in 2009, so a year before 2010. But I truly love this album, and it needed to be on the list. Now, she's a great jazz singer. This is on the Verve label. And along with the Harrow and Harvest album, this is the other album that sounds fantastic and would really impress people if you're playing it on your turntable on your home stereo. The album is available not only on vinyl at 33 1/3, but also there are versions out there, if you can find them still, on 45 RPM as well as on CD. And why I love this album, it has fabulous music, arrangements, orchestration, and has top-notch sound quality. There are 12 songs on this album, and as many of you know, on jazz albums there are a lot of remakes, and yet on this album 11 of the songs are originals by Melody Gardot, and only one is a remake, the great song Over the Rainbow. The album has received 3 Grammy nominations and has sold over 1.5 million copies worldwide. This album has a very quiet, intimate feeling to it, and Melody sings with very quiet vocals on this album. Now, there's a very good reason for it, and that is of her past history. What happened was Melody was a amateur pianist, loved music, and she was involved in a very bad accident. She was a cyclist and was hit by a car and ended up in the hospital for many, many months. And she had to relearn how to do some simple tasks that we do every day and take it for granted. Now, during her recovery, one of the physicians told her that if she could hum or sing, that would help her quickly recover, since you're stimulating the brain quite a bit with singing. Now, she took that to heart, and although she couldn't play the piano because she was laid up on her back, she did learn how to play the guitar, and that she could do lying on her back, and so she did. Melody first started humming and later singing, and then she got inspired and started composing songs. And she sings in hushed tones because she became very sensitive to both light and sound. So this is how she developed her very endearing style that she uses in most of her albums. If you're counting, that was number 9, so I only have one to go. And here it is, number 10, and that is The River and the Thread by the great Rosanne Cash. This album came out in 2014, and although she is a country Americana singer, this is on the Blue Note label, just like Norah Jones is, so they do have another artist of similar style. Now, Rosanne recorded this album, and I loved it the second I played it. And I thought, this is one of the best albums I've heard in 2014. And believe it or not, I couldn't believe it, but it won the best folk album of 2015, as well as the best American roots performance. Rosanne has made some very good and even some great albums, but I think of all the albums, this is the one I think is her best. Her singing on this album is quite tender with a longing feeling. The album was written when Rosanne took on a project to restore her father's childhood home. When she did that, she kind of got back to her roots and rekindled her love of the Southern folk and also that country sound, and that inspired her to make this album. Rosanne has many good records, and I'm just showing this one because many viewers have mentioned this album to me, and I knew about the album, but I'll show it anyway for those of you who don't know it. It's her album called The List. Now, it's very interesting where the album got its name. This album has 12 classic country songs. When Rosanne was young and went on the road with her father and she started wanting to sing, she kind of asked her dad's advice. And so he says, well, do you know this country song? She said, never heard of it. She said, what about that one? No. What about this one? No. And he was horrified. And so Johnny sat down and he wrote her a list of the 100 essential country songs. And she studied the list, and she kept the list for 35 years. I guess it's just kind of holding on to a piece of her father and a great memory. And from that list, she picked 12 classic country tunes and made the album The List. And it's another great one to pick up if you have a little extra time on your hands and you happen to like the album The River and the Thread. As an aside, the Grammy nominating committee never agrees with my pick, and that's why in 2015 when they picked Rosanne Cash's album as the best Americana album, I wholeheartedly agreed. Not only that, my favorite rock album of the year was by Beck, and that is Morning Phase. And I show the album just because it's connected to the other one somehow, because my two picks for my favorite artists for that year, they both won the Grammy, which I'm sure will never happen again. And what I remember about Morning Phase is I played the album, and one of my early listens was with my son, who was a Beck fan as well. And I don't know, I was captivated by the album. And it occurred to me that this album reminds me so much of Dark Side of the Moon. Now, of course, the music is nothing like Dark Side of the Moon, and I don't want to directly compare it. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the emotional connection I had with this album is very similar to what I feel when I listen to Dark Side of the Moon. Okay, that's really an aside. Anyway, I hope you get a chance to listen to the album, and in the comment sections below, let me know if you know these albums, if you agree with my choices, or if you have picks since 2010 that I should listen to and consider putting on my top 10 list. And now for last video's unknown album. The first unknown album is English Settlement by the great band XTC. This album is on the Virgin label and came out in 1982, and it's XTC's fifth studio album. Now, XTC prior to this time had a lot of quirky pop sounding albums, some of which were quite good, especially individual songs, but I think this is their first album that from start to finish, the songs are all very strong. Some people consider it their best album. I don't, but I do think it is one of their best, and it's very accessible. So if you are new to XTC and want to check out an album, I think this is a great album to start with. This album is a more mature album with better arrangement and more interesting musically. Also, it has a bit of a pastoral theme to it, and you will find that XTC kind of transitioned here, and pastoral themes seem to stick with them through the remainder of their career, even though they do present a pop sound. Finally, just a mention about XTC. I think they are an extremely underappreciated band. The reason I say that is the following. Since the breakup of the Beatles, there has been many bands that have that pop rock sound. And I think of all the bands that came after the Beatles, XTC is the best pop rock band since 1970 to the present time. So I know that's high praise. So if you don't know XTC, you should check them out, and you won't be disappointed. The second unknown album is by Traffic, and that is John Barleycorn Must Die. This album came out in 1970. It is on the Island label in the UK and on the United Artists label here in the US. This album is a blues-influenced album, and actually Traffic had just broken up, and this was sort of going to be the solo project of Steve Winwood, but he did bring back two of his bandmates. Dave Mason had left already and started his solo career, and he got back with Jim Capaldi and Chris Wood and recorded this album. Now, although it might not be Traffic's best album, it has a lot of very well-recorded songs, some that stick with me to this day, especially the track Glad. I love the instrumentation and the beat of that song. And now for this video's unknown albums. The first unknown album. Great. Hope you got that one. The second unknown album. Great. Hope you got that one too. As always, if you think you know the answers, let me know in the comment sections below, and I'll let you know how you did. As always, this is Alex with All About Albums. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. And remember, keep them spinning.